Alright guys, so welcome back to the channel. Crimson Desert has been pretty damn active over the last couple of weeks. They've dropped a plethora of trailers, information, details, and breakdowns when it comes to the game. And I gotta say, there is so much going on with Crimson Desert. The launch is about a month away and we have to really talk about it. There's been a ton of trailers that's breaking down so many system mechanics, progression, combat, exploration, all the open world, and just a ton more things. I want to give you guys a video where I just compile all the stuff, maybe point out the most important stuff, so you are all caught up before the game actually comes out, so you're in the know. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's dive right on into it. Alright, first off, we're going to be going over what happened in the very first video, the one that's centered around Cliff in the open world. And right out the gate, we got what was probably one of the biggest drops about the game so far, multiple playable characters. Now obviously, a couple of weeks later, we know that there are multiple playable characters, but at the time we didn't know that. So that was a pretty big reveal. Now obviously Cliff is the main protagonist. He is positioned as the narrative anchor of the story. And as from everything that we've seen so far, all major paths will generally lead back to him whenever it comes to any like major decisions and things in the narrative. Cliff is obviously the main guy. Now the other two characters we saw was first, we saw a female fighter. I don't want to necessarily label her as a rogue, but she absolutely is a dexterous combat style. What makes her specifically interesting is her weapon combination. She had a greatsword paired with a pistol. Typically, when we think of greatsword users, we think of like slower, more methodical, heavier hitting combat style. That's not what we see here in Crimson Desert. She appears to be like very fast, agile, and very fluid, which is completely different than what we expect from a greatsword user. On the other end, we actually saw another character who looks closer to a warrior or like maybe a barbarian archetype, who was wielding an axe alongside what appears to be a hand cannon. His attacks looked heavier, more hard hitting, but clearly designed around those bigger impact playstyle. Now, regardless of how different the characters appear stylistically, one thing is very clear: the combat remains very fast and fluid. Of course, this is the same developers behind Black Desert, so that's kind of expected, but Crimson Desert is leaning heavily into that more action combat. Whether you're playing Cliff or you're playing either of these two characters, the gameplay is consistent and they're going to be emphasizing that speed, responsiveness, mobility, even if you're using a slower, more heavier weapon. In addition to character reveals, we also got more context about what's happening in the world. Cliff, the main character, is part of a group known as the Greymanes. From what we can gather, this faction has broken apart for some reason we don't fully yet understand. I think it was hinted at that there was like a huge war and another clan kind of like took it over, surprised him, and got the better of his clan. His clan is scattered around the world, and there's going to be numerous clans operating in the world, so we're going to be going through the world and interacting with a ton of different clans. And the central idea or the objective seems to be leaning towards the direction of kind of reuniting the faction and rebuilding its strength, rebuilding the camp, and getting the Greymanes back together. Now, how does the rebuilding work? From what I can tell, it appears tied to exploration, gathering, and faction-based missions, depending on which group you choose to support. So from what we've seen in the trailer specifically, at least from the earlier impressions, this is going to be something of a rebuilding system. If you ever played a game like No Man's Sky or even Red Dead Redemption, where you actually restore the strength of your like outpost or the location where you're living by bringing resources, and that's kind of roughly the same structure that we're going to be expecting with the game. Overall, there seems to be a lot happening in the open world in terms of the framework. Now, another key element I really want to highlight from this first trailer is how the world interacts with you, especially through NPC engagement. And I'll probably use this comparison a lot because the design philosophy feels very similar to that of Red Dead Redemption, but what you do in the world appears to carry weight. When you approach NPC and speak with them, they provide knowledge and information about the region, what's happening in that zone, and potential opportunities. But the interaction system doesn't stop at simple dialogue. You actually get behavioral choices. For example, just like in Red Dead Redemption, you can threaten NPCs, you can intimidate them, and depending on how you encounter unfolds, you may unlock new quests or potentially lose out on other content altogether. Now that isn't confirmed, but if we're going with the systems that we've seen in the past, or at least from what it seems to be, that could be, a route that actually happens in the game. So the idea is, for example, if you intimidate someone, they might open up a new opportunity, but if you fail the intimidation, you could lose out on a quest entirely. I don't think that would be anything specific to like MSQ stuff, but for like a lot of the side quests and side content, that could be like the depth that they're going for in this game. Now, layered into that knowledge system, you're not just gaining information through conversation, but also through exploration and observation. Again, this strongly echoes mechanics we've seen in games like Where Winds Meet. If you're a regular watcher of the channel, then you're very familiar familiar with things like this, the idea that by interacting with the world, watching, studying, and observing, you can potentially learn moves, skills, or abilities. From a foundational standpoint, the open world in the NPC interaction system is going to look pretty deep. We're not going to talk about that just yet because we got more information on like that kind of stuff in a later trailer, but that's kind of like the impression we got from this first one. Now, wrapping up what we saw in the first trailer, we got a broader look at the world itself. We saw a large variety of biomes. This was like desert regions, forest areas, plains, just like a ton of different places, alongside the ability to see like multiple cities. And I don't even want to say this because it sounds a bit, exaggerated, but the environmental variety gives me like a serious Skyrim 2.0 vibe in terms of like the diversity in the cities and stuff. So I'm definitely getting like a lot of like Elder Scrolls vibe with the game. We also saw outposts scattered throughout the world. These locations appear to have been taken over by hostile factions, and as the player, we'll be reclaiming them. I think the goal seems to be about giving the outposts back to the original owners, building up like rapport, like faction, like experience, strengthening your reputation, that kind of thing. And then they should be supporting the Grey Mains in their cause, at least in the broader picture. At least that's what it seems like. Overall, the first trailer revealed a lot, and this is just a small snippet of everything that was shown in that trailer. Alright, now let's move on to the second trailer, which shifts heavily into the combat and the progression, and more importantly, how the character growth actually functions, at least as much as we can see in a limited trailer. So the major focus here was revolving around the artifact system as well as a direct learning system. As I said a second ago, if you play Where Winds Meet, where you learn different abilities and stuff like that from observation, that's kind of what this is. We're going to talk about that in a second, but most importantly, we got to see some actual combat, and more importantly, for a lot of players, elemental abilities integrated directly into Cliff's attacks. Now, we got to see like a scroll menu that showed a different variety of different magics available, or I'm assuming elemental attacks. It's hard to say because we don't know directly how it works, but we had wind magic, fire, nature, ice, and electric, and then there was a lot of other things on the scroll wheel that we could see. Now, obviously, I haven't played the game, but I'm going to expect to see significantly more magic types and different kind of spells. I would even be shocked if there isn't even like a spellcaster playthrough or a spellcaster option. Of course, we're just seeing mainly him doing his sword stuff, but I'm assuming there's going to be like a spellcaster like angle as well. Now, throughout the combat sequence, we actually did see Cliff actively weaving abilities together, chaining attacks, and swapping between multiple elemental types mid-engagement. And if you've ever played any games in like a fantasy setting, this has potential for enemies to have like resistances or weaknesses to specific elements. I'm sure that's going to be something in the game. We haven't had the ability to dive deep into the monster variety in this video, which we're going to be going over that in a future video. But if you've ever played RPG games, you know how it is. Certain enemies are weaker to certain elements, like trolls are usually good against ice or something, so on and so forth. So I'm assuming this system is going to essentially mean you're going to have to swap on the fly, have a well set up so you can actually fight them. And that's kind of how I'm expecting it to go. Again, pure speculation, but that's kind of the idea. Now, beyond abilities, the trailer also highlighted what looked like a pretty solid gear system and something of a looting system. Now, if you know anything about me, I love making builds and being able to see that their gear is going to be tailored. That's pretty exciting. Now, while this isn't necessarily confirmed, from what I can tell, it does look like there's going to be gear specific to certain bosses. This is what Playable has historically been good at, so I wouldn't even be surprised if there are like bosses that drop specific gear. I mean, Playable is known for MMOs after all, so I wouldn't even be surprised if there's gear specific to like certain skills being tied to them and stuff like that. I'm assuming that's kind of how that's going to work. And then there's a very real chance we'll be learning abilities from the bosses themselves. Actually, in the trailer, we actually got to see some of this actually happening, where the person is learning from what looked like a boss or an elite style enemy themselves. Now, if you've ever played Where Winds Meet, this concept will be very familiar. We've done this many times here on the channel where we talked about this, but for those of you who are not like familiar with Where Winds Meet, what's going to happen is you're going to watch the enemies do their different moves, how they attack, how they execute certain techniques, and then you begin to learn and eventually use portions of those skills yourself, eventually mastering it and becoming better at it. I'm not sure how the system is going to play out, if you need to observe it one time, multiple times, so on and so forth, whatever the case is. But regardless, as you continue to use the skill, you're probably going to get better at it and get more benefits and bonuses. And that in itself is already insane, because that's going to create insane synergies with certain builds. because that's going to be a lot of build diversity. If you can learn skills from one enemy and bring it over to another, tie it with your magic, your gear, there can be some crazy builds in the game. Now, outside of enemy observation, there's appears to be more of a conventional progression path through the artifact system, but we haven't seen an extensive breakdown of the skill tree. We did get like a small snippet of it and what we could allocate with things like stamina and health and the type of foundational attributes you kind of come to expect from RPGs. More interestingly though, what we were able to spot was 2 character names introduced in the previous trailers that we talked about, and that is positioned within the interface. From that alone, we can reasonably confirm that the characters are not just narrative figures, but playable ones that are going to have their own progression system. Now, I'm not sure how this progression system is going to work, if they're going to share different things or maybe you tailor them. I'm assuming there's going to be something of a swap system, but we haven't necessarily seen anything like that yet, so I don't want to assume that, but that's kind of how I'm guessing it. You're going to build the barbarian guy to be a little bit more frontliney, the dexterous girl, and then maybe your main character Cliff is going to be like a little bit more open-ended, tailored to the style that you need them for. That's just guessing, but that could be the angle because they do have, you know, their own spot within the tree. Now, as for the artifacts themselves, their acquisition seems to be tied to mainly exploration, very reminiscent of games like Zelda Breath of the Wild. If you ever played a game like that, where you get rewards from just exploring the world, which is always something I usually praise for like any development team that makes it so when you're exploring, there's actually tangible benefit. So you're going to be doing like adventuring, you're going to do different puzzles and tackling points of interest, things like that, use abilities and tools that you learn throughout the game, get the artifacts, and then those artifacts are going to directly feed into your character's growth. At least that's what the structure appears to be, which is a really great structure in my opinion. Now, in addition to skills and artifacts, which is very key to progression on your character, we also got confirmation of a blacksmith and gear crafting, weapons being upgraded, stat increasing for example, and we can clearly see attack values rising after enhancing. The most important layer here that we actually got to see was actually the inclusion of affixes and socketing. Now, obviously, when it comes to anything that has affixes, this means that you can tailor a build a little bit more towards what you enjoy. There's a lot of build versatility it adds to it, and well, there's going to be affixes. So far, what we saw was up to 3 affixes that had a variety of different stats, but there's also going to be socketing, which is going to push the depth of this even further. In the footage, what we saw were gems being inserted that granted bonuses such as destruction, which was like attack increase, Gale 1, which was attack speed, Gale 2, which was attack speed 2, and then we got rampaging insight for increased critical chance. Now, these are pretty big modifiers. Obviously, they're going to make a build more specific, and that's something that's like really big for combat performance and things like that. So really big reveal there. Now, obviously, we've only seen so much, and I'm expecting some of the gems to be significantly better as you progress through the game. Maybe as you learn to blacksmith and things of the sort, you're going to get way better gems. That's kind of the idea. I'm expecting activities like mining or even doing like dungeons or bosses could drop these gems, or just interacting with the abyss system. That's going to be able to drop it. So yeah, that's going to be a really interesting system, and I think this is going to be look really good for character building. In my opinion, those are the major takeaways for the second trailer. Let's talk about the third and final trailer. Alright, finally, let's move on to the third and final trailer, and this is the more recent one called Life in Pywell. I think that's how you say the region, Pywell. And honestly, this is probably the most exciting in the entire showcase so far. Not necessarily because of like the combat or the gameplay or anything like that, but just simply because of immersion. Now, I'm not really a creator known for immersion. I'm known for builds and things like that. But the depth of the immersion that we saw in this trailer has me pretty excited in itself, because you don't see this level of immersion. You don't see this level of depth in how you do things. And so that's why I'm really excited, but we'll talk about it right now. So first off, we're introduced to where the camp, or your camp that you're going to be basically building up for your faction, is introduced, and this is going to be in the Hernan region. And most importantly, the takeaway for the trailer is how the building actually worked. This isn't just you like walking up or clicking a button and then it like prefabbed or anything like that. You actually, the character physically build it, like you're picking up pieces, you're placing them down, you're hammering posts, you're actually constructing the space, and obviously that's massive for immersion. Everything we've seen so far with Crimson Desert seems to lean into that idea that you're really interacting with the world directly. I digress, but you're really interacting with the world. On top of that, we actually got to see the camp management screen, which you actually get the overview of what's going on with your camp. So obviously this is pretty big, and even more so, we actually got to see how the livestock was like moving around and things like that. I really wanted to point that out specifically, because that to me is like super immersion-y, and I really like that stuff because that kind of stuff makes me want to go out and go find the animals and move them around and actually build a proper base. I'm not sure how in-depth this is going to be, but if we can actually build a proper camp and the effort that we put into it actually directly translate, like you could actually have a full farm or something like that, that would be insane. Now, as you probably come to expect, you're going to expand your camp by doing different kind of missions out in the world. You'll attract people, you'll recruit NPCs, and then you'll build your settlement or your camp over time. Some people seem to grow through like direct interaction, or they'll join through just completing the main story quest. Whatever the case is, you're going to actually have a system where people actually jumps in, join your camp and join your mission. But it's not just people living in your camp, there's actually like systems tied behind that. So you're going to basically send them out to do missions, and we're not talking about just like simple things like supply runs. You're going to actually send them out to rebuild the world, very reminiscent of what we saw in the first trailer where you're actually building the world. We actually saw Cliff dispatch members of like the Grey Mains who handle certain tasks and outcomes depending on their individual expertise. Now that suggests that the NPCs themselves are going to have their own skill set, and so if you, for example, send someone who is bad at masonry to actually build something like a statue, there's a very real chance that it's going to fail, or it's going to be not a good result. It's not going to progress your bar very well, and that's, you know, kind of something you need to keep in mind as you're making those actual management decisions. You're obviously going to be managing roles. You're going to be having to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, and even on the surface level look, the camp system is actually pretty deep. Again, we haven't gotten a super in-depth look at this system, how deep it can be, and even now it looks pretty insane. Now, moving on to something a little bit more character related, we actually got to see character customization. I'm not going to say they showed us everything because it was like a brief, I don't know, couple of seconds of like seeing a little bit of the progression on how you can make your character, but there's going to be like beards, eyebrows, facial features, tattoos, tons of color options, pretty much everything that you need to customize your character pretty decently. Again, we haven't seen the full depth of it, but it's probably going to be pretty good. Now, finally, towards the end of that trailer, we're gonna do a bit of a rapid fire, so you know we can just cover a few systems. What we saw were, one, a bounty system, or like a wanted system. Essentially, if you're doing what you do, you know, being toxic and doing criminal stuff, shady stuff, there's obviously going to be consequences. We see NPCs like attacking Cliff, or whoever character it is at the time. I think it was Cliff. And, you know, your reputation is going to actually affect how your progression works. From what we know of this system, if you're too much of a criminal, the people that you've helped in the past, or people like kind of you're like trying to get your renown with, this will directly affect it. So you need to be kind of smart on do it. You're not going to necessarily be a super criminal unless you want to play that way, but for most players, you're going to want to like manage the system pretty well. There seems to be a way to deal with the penalties, which is by just, you know, going to go pay it off. But we did see that in one of the snippets that Cliff was in jail and he got released. I don't know the extent of how the jail system is going to work. If you ever played the Black Desert, then if it's anything like that, if you're doing a lot of stuff, you could be in there for weeks, actual real time weeks. I mean, I think that's an extreme situation. I think I was in jail for like 2 days one time, but regardless, there seemed to be a punishment system, timed or not, who knows, but we'll see that soon. We also saw a ton of side activities, which was fishing, which was like mini games, stuff like that. We saw carnival style stuff. We even saw like this coin game that were being played. Not surely what all that stuff was, but obviously something you can do in the game. We saw horse taming also showed up, so you're going to be able to get horses. Possibility of breeding horses. There could be a breeding angle there as well. You're of course going to have to do what you've done in similar games like Where Winds Meet, where you need to sneak up on the horse, jump on his back, break it, and of course it becomes your horse. There's possibly an angle for like a super horse angle there. It could be cool. Whatever the case is, we'll see obviously. And we also got to see hunting, which was another big one. You get to track animals, gather pelts and furs, and that of course is giving off the strong Red Dead Redemption vibes that we talked about before. And even more so, there was a ton of just like background things going on. There's like factories and just a ton of different events going on. So there's obviously going to be a lot of mini games and like side activities to do outside of the main story stuff. And that's where we kind of wrap this video up. That's pretty much everything you need to know in terms of what we've seen in the last 3 major trailers for Crimson Desert. I gotta say, as someone who's been really interested in the game for the last, like, I don't know, 2 years, this trailer really, like, with these trailers, really gave me a better outlook on how the game is, and I'm actually way more excited than I probably should have been more excited about this game, but now this really got me excited. But you gotta know what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Are you guys optimistic about the game? I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm pretty pretty optimistic about the game. Let me know what you guys think, your favorite thing from this, and what you guys are looking forward to the most. As always, guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next Crimson Desert video extremely soon.